Okay, hello YouTube. So I'm here today with Philip Goff, who wants to talk about moral realism, which is that's cool. That's a topic I enjoy. So we're going to be doing that, and I will just I don't know. Do you want to introduce yourself? Anything you want to say?
Not especially.
Okay.
Thanks for having me on. I cheekily invited myself on because, there's been a lot of interesting discussion about moral realism, moral objectivity on my Twitter the last week or so, which is Philip_Goff. Just a quick add there, and then I enjoyed your video. Just got talking with Lance Bush about well, both of you having very much the opposite opinion to me, but I really enjoyed it, and so I thought it would be good to have a little chat to express my views and to discuss it.
Yeah, cool,
On
great.
video forum.
Okay.
I generally
I,
talk about panpsychism, I guess, but generally write about consciousness, but I'm really interested in lots of questions about the nature of reality, and this is one big one.
I mean,
So,
in some ways, it's maybe it's maybe a bit of a shame that we've gone for this topic because I have spoken to quite a few people about meta-ethics recently, and I don't know, maybe I should
branch
expand into
out.
other areas a bit more. But I yeah, to be honest, when it comes to philosophy of mind stuff, I'm really behind on all of that. I haven't really done so much sort of reading about that in the last
Right.
few years. So
Oh, we could talk
yeah.
about consciousness some other time. What was your? I heard you just submitted your PhD. What was? And it was
I
philosophy of
did,
science.
yeah. Philosophy of science. So meta-ethics isn't sort of my area of expertise, but I'd say it's the area that I'm probably my second favourite, if I had to pick one.
Well, it's maybe the same with me. Actually, I've actually never written on meta-ethics, but I've always been, really interested in it, and I've always had really good colleagues doing meta-ethics,
Hmm.
and so I've, always talked about it, and yeah. So looking forward to having a chat.
Okay, great. Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess you you did
Like,
ask. So do
yeah,
you
yeah.
want
As
to
soon as
begin?
I cheekily invite myself, yeah. Well, I mean, I guess on that podcast, on that discussion, you were talking about, and this is what someone connected you to this discussion, because your um puzzlement about how to make sense of categorical oughts, and so I thought maybe we could start there, because a little bit of autobiography. I used to be have the same kind of intuition. I used to be an error theorist, and so I don't want that to sound like patronizing. I used to think your view, and then I grew out of it. But just as a matter of autobiography, I used to, when I started my graduate study, I had error theory intuition. So people don't know what that is. It's the view that all moral statements are false, right? So that there are no facts about morality, or maybe value more generally, and all statements about value purport to be talking about this realm of objective value facts, but because there is no realm of objective value facts, all moral statements, perhaps all value statements, are false, right? So I used to have that kind of that view when I started my graduate study. In my graduate study, there were some really great moral philosophers, Jonathan Dancy and Philip Stratton Lake, and they kind of persuaded me away from this. And I guess it was generally just making me appreciate how ubiquitous kind of value claims are. I mean, just to say one example, that we make value claims with reference to evidence, sort of you ought to proportion your belief to the evidence, or you ought not to believe contradictions, and so on. Hey, maybe that's something we could talk about, but what I want to start with, which is what I'm mainly banging on about on Twitter a lot, is the foundational intuition I found I couldn't deny. A bit like Descartes, trying to doubt everything until you. I mean, I don't think it's an undoubtable truth, but the value claim I end up finding it hard to deny is as follows, right? So, I mean, so suppose you're a kind of, just to set the context. Sorry, I'm talking a lot, but just
It's
I'm
okay,
getting to,
no problem.
I'm getting to the point now. Just to set the context, if you have some kind of Humean view, where if people don't know what that is, where basically all one's reasons are in some way grounded in one's desires, right? So this is influenced by David Hume, who said reason is the slave of the passions. So if you have that kind of view, then all fundamental life goals are on a par, have to be on a par, right? Because reasons only get going once someone has some life goals, some kind of fundamental goals in life or psychological directedness at a certain goal. And then they can have reasons, right? But you only get reasons at that point. So when we're talking about just someone's basic fundamental goals, they can't, they're just on a par. So the problem for me is, imagine Susan, her fundamental life goal is counting blades of grass, right? And, she sweats and toils and cheats and lies, or, her whole life is based around counting as many blades of grass as she wants. And crucially, this is the crucial point, she doesn't enjoy it, right? She doesn't get any pleasure from it. It's just, and she's not doing it for the sake of someone else. Whenever I raise this on Twitter, people say, oh, well, you could get meditation through counting it, or, you could get a sense of spiritual, or it could be like Sudoku, someone would say. But I'm saying she's not doing it because of anything. It's not an instrumental goal for the purpose, at the sake of some other goal. She's doing it for its own sake in order to get more blades of grass counted. Right, that's their fundamental. Okay, and if you're Humean, I think you have to say that is no worse than any other life goal. And I just think that is just such a totally pointless waste of time. And you contrast it to scientific advance to pursuing learning and knowledge, or finding a cure for the pandemic, or just trying to be happy and make your kids and family happy or whatever. In contrast, they seem like things that are worth doing, whereas counting blades of grass is not worth doing. So this is my fundamental. It's not so much necessarily a moral intuition. So I think when I was in an error theorist, I was thinking about morality, and what if you just think about morality, maybe you could think, oh, maybe that's not real, maybe that's just projections of our emotions. But this fundamental value claim, which I do take to be a claim of objective value, that there is a distinction between things that are worth doing and things that are not worth doing, and that's not dependent on people's desires. So anyway, that's my claim. I can't. Seems to me in some sense self-evident.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, what do you think of that?
I suppose it's just one point of clarification about just my own position. I wouldn't say that I'm an error theorist. I'm kind of inclined to it, but the reason is because error theorists are committed to a particular view of the semantics of moral judgments, which I'm not convinced of anymore. So I would say I'm a sort of general anti-realist, but it might well be the case that I'm not sure that there really is a sort of universal or determinate semantics for moral judgments in general. So just to kind of clarify that, where I'm coming from.
I heard you. I didn't mean to say. Maybe I don't think I said.
I don't think you did.
I used to be an error theorist. I used to be.
You sort of said, oh well, you were kind of coming from a similar position as me, but I just thought I would, make that. Yeah. Also, the other point is, you mentioned this thing about how, you might well reject sort of moral normativity, but you might think that that's like something different. For me, I think I'm going to be an anti-realist about normativity in general. So I mean, that's something that. Yes, some people might sort of take that line, but you don't have to worry about that with me because, I'm puzzled by normativity just across the board. So I think that the example that you've given, to be honest, I just don't have the intuition that you do. I- it seems that obviously to me, I mean, I wouldn't want to sit around counting blades of grass, and I might even pass judgments about other people's behavior. I mean, obviously, from an anti-realist point of view, you can still do that. I can still make claims about what I consider to be worthwhile, and I might, universalize those. Although actually that's not really my inclination. I tend to be fairly live and let live. So if somebody wants to sit around counting blades of grass, I mean, that seems fine to me. I don't have the intuition that there's anything worse off about that kind of life than mine. And it's funny that you mentioned this point that people say, oh, well, maybe she's getting pleasure out of it. Because as you were talking about that, it sort of made me reflect on my life and how I feel with many of the things I do that I'm sort of just driven to do them by some sort of force that I don't understand and is out of my control. I'm not sure that I get a lot of pleasure out of what I do. So the idea of somebody counting blades of grass and just not getting pleasure out of it's like, okay, yeah, that's not a goal that I have, but doesn't seem fundamentally different to me doing philosophy. I happen for some reason to have this drive to do philosophy. I think I'm okay at it at least, and I just do it, and that's it. And maybe I get pleasure out of it, but that doesn't seem to be my primary motivation. So
that's really interesting. I mean, I think one issue here is that the word desire, I always feel, is really ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
And people just talk, when they talk about the human being, they talk about, oh yeah, your reasons are grounded in your desires. But I think desire can mean lots of different things. I think at least three things it means. Like, one, a sort of conscious urge, when you're really craving chocolate or something. Mm-hmm. That's, I think that's the most obvious use of the word desire. But also, I think it can often mean that you would like something. So I think often when you're choosing on a menu, you're not sort of salivating. I mean, sometimes you are, but not necessarily thinking, which am I feeling that? You just think, I would enjoy that. And you go for it because you would enjoy it. But then a third use of desire is which I think is just to mean you are psychologically directed at a certain goal, mm-hmm. which, it could be you don't get any, you're not yearning for that goal. So, and you won't get any pleasure from it. It might be something like a tortured artist who thinks creativity is important and they hate it, or scientific advancement, or helping other people, something. So I think a lot of people, when they have the humane view, they're just sort of conflating all of these and thinking when they say, oh, I desire, I want something, so that gives me a reason. They're sort of meaning it will give me pleasure. But I think, if something will give you pleasure, that does give you an objective reason to do it. But anyway, I'm just wanted to distinguish those things. But come back to what you say. You just say some force pushes you to do things. Isn't it the case that a lot of the time you do something you think, it's not, I mean, like, let me give an example from my own case, right? I'm still a bit kind of OCD. Like, I still feel the urge to avoid cracks on the pavement, or mm-hmm. actually if I step on a crack with my left foot, then I feel the need to do it with my right foot to make it symmetrical, and then I feel the need to do the whole thing in reverse, right? But I find I feel like I have absolutely, that's irrational, that's compulsive. Why is it compulsive? Because I've got absolutely no reason to do it. It's totally pointless. It's something I feel driven to do. But isn't it the case, like, it seems like for most of my decisions, it's not like that. It's, I think this would give me pleasure, so that's a reason, or it would give someone else pleasure, I would learn something. Don't you find in your own psychology something like that distinction between just because you're saying you just feel driven by stuff? Don't you feel that distinction between maybe things you have a compulsion to do, but it's just pointless, as opposed to things where it's worth doing. You judge that it's worth doing. Can you not make that distinction between in your own action choice?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that what goes on. So the way it seems to me, and it's really hard because I often feel like I don't have a lot of access to my own motivations or even necessarily what my own experience is like. Um, so I don't know to what extent I'm just sort of making this up. But I think that the way I would see this is, I have a lot of goals, and some of those goals are going to be instrumental because it's like I recognize, okay, so I have the goal to do X, and I recognize that Y is the means of achieving X, so I want to do Y in order to get X. And then in some cases I'm going to have goals that are sort of conflicting. I might recognize that Y is the means of achieving X, but then it conflicts with other things that I want. And so that means that I have to engage in this. Well, maybe I don't have to, but because I have the ability to engage in sort of deliberation, I guess I can think about these, and sometimes I do. Sometimes I might recognize that. So I might have, say, I go downstairs and I see some chocolate cake, and I find myself driven towards it. I get the immediate sort of urge to eat it.
Can you clarify that when you say you're driven towards it? Like, is it the sort of yearning, or is it the, oh, I'd like that?
I'm using it in the yearning sense. Although I mean, okay. I don't think it makes much difference to my point. We could use it just in the sort of, I want the taste in my mouth, but I don't feel the yearning. But I'm imagining a situation where I go downstairs, I see the chocolate cake, and I'm like, oh yes, that kind of thing. But then I might sort of stop myself and think, oh well, look, I want to live as long as possible. That's one of my goals, and if I just gorge on chocolate cake all day, that's going to make me unhealthy. So I'll avoid the chocolate cake. I'll eat something healthy instead. I can do that, and that seems like maybe that's the kind of thing that you might be talking about there. But then to me it would be, I'd say, well, maybe I in some sense, like, I have a reason not to eat the chocolate cake. But then if I was to say that I have a reason not to eat the chocolate cake, I think what I'm expressing there is, well, I have this goal of living a long time. I recognize that a certain diet is part of the means by which I achieve that goal. And also having a certain diet doesn't cause too much frustration to my other desires. Like, okay, I have to forego a nice taste in my mouth, but then I'm going to have lots of other things that give me pleasure, so it's not a big deal to me. And that seems to be all that's involved there.
And so you don't recognize this, just like, I don't know whether you have any kind of what we might think of as compulsive behavior, like, or if you even if you don't try and put yourself in the mindset of, feeling the need to, walk on cracks in the pavement or avoid them. And I want to say, why do we stop ourselves doing that? Like, we stop ourselves doing that sort of stuff, whereas we wouldn't stop ourselves if we've got like a real drive to learn. You wouldn't say, we make a distinction there. What's going on there? Is it just, I don't want to say psychologically, at least, maybe we're deeply deluded, but psychologically it's like, because walking on cracks is just bloody pointless. It's just pointless. Whereas learning is worth doing. Do you not feel that at least?
I do know the sort of thing you're talking about. No, I have some similar things. With me, it's I have the compulsion to count the number of letters in words. And if I'm reading anything online, then sometimes I have the compulsion, for some reason, to highlight particular numbers of the middle letters of words. So I don't know why. Sometimes I do it. Sometimes
nice. I like that one.
Resist it.
I have a thing actually with a hot cup of tea, feeling the warmth when I picked it up, and I sort of feel the need to. Anyway, go on.
So no, I get that. I think that it's one of, and I mean, look, I can't speak for other people, but I think that one of the goals that I have is a sort of just consistency of like of goals, right? Of my other goals, of desires. And then there are some things, like in this case, where performing this action of sort of having to count the number of letters in words, that doesn't sort of achieve any other goal. It might be a goal just in itself, but it also frustrates other goals that I have. So when I want to, read an article, it can get in the way of doing that if I end up getting distracted by this desire to count number of letters in words. And so I think it makes sense from that point of view that I would then, resist that. Like there's something, what I want to do, it's like, okay, I have this sort of longer term goal of reading the article, learning something, and I know that that's going to be frustrated if I just get distracted by this compulsion. So in many ways, to me, it seems kind of similar to the sort of chocolate cake case. But then, if I can sort of step back again and reflect on that desire to learn and to read the article, and actually that seems like just a sort of brute compulsion as well. That's why I said earlier that I felt myself sort of driven by these, like a force that I don't really understand. Yeah. Maybe that's unusual, but.
So you think but okay, so you've given one reason to get rid of compulsive behavior, that it gets in the way of your other desires, and we can make sense of all that on a sort of Humean picture. But isn't there also isn't there also something where we just think in itself it's pointless? I mean, it's not like it's not like we it's not like there's some people who we think who do go in for their compulsions in a big way, and we think, oh, that's fine, that's just like learning or something. So you don't, at least psychologically, feel there's something there that we try to stop these things just because they're pointless. I mean, look, one thing, like, it seems like from what you were saying, it's not simply that you don't believe in categorical oughts, but that you just find it absolutely baffling. So to follow that through, are you saying, you just find it, that idea that we should stop compulsions because they're pointless, do you find that baffling?
Oh, well, I mean, I could have, so if somebody said, look, don't do this because it's pointless, I would probably be able to understand what they were saying. So I think when people talk about, like, reasons for doing things or why they ought to do things, usually, or what has a point or what doesn't have a point or what has a purpose. Obviously, these sorts of statements occur, in a particular context, and I can usually sort of assign meaning on the basis of that context. And when philosophers start talking about, like, stance independent reasons for doing things or categorical reasons and so on, that's where I start to become puzzled. Now, if somebody was to say about, like, my behavior of counting the numbers of letters in words, if they would say, well, look, that's pointless, there's a few things that they might have in mind with that. I mean, so first of all, they might be saying, they might recognize that I have the goal of reading this article and learning the relevant bit of philosophy, and then they can recognize that what I'm doing is not a very effective means of achieving that goal. They might mean something like that, or they might be sort of thinking about things from a more kind of social point of view, and they might say, well, there are some behaviors that we engage in which will help to satisfy the interests of other people. And when I do philosophy, loads of other people get, well, maybe not always, but at least sometimes other people get benefit from it, because maybe I might write an article that gets published somewhere, or I might make a video and that sort of goes out into the world. Lots of people get a benefit from that. Whereas if it's just me sitting in my room just counting letters, nobody else is going to get anything from that. So they might say that that's sort of pointless or worthless in that sense. And I can understand that. But, if we sort of imagine a world in which for some reason everybody really cares about counting the numbers of letters in words or counting blades of grass.
What do you mean by cares? Clarify cares there. In the sense that
let's say it's just for some reason they just have the goal of
yeah. So I think it's got to be that they don't enjoy it.
Yeah. So
and they don't crave it.
It's not something that is going to bring them pleasure. It's not something that, like when I look at the chocolate cake and I feel that like urge towards it. It's not. So I'll all of that. It's just like a goal that they have. Well, I mean, maybe it's kind of hard to say in that sort of counterfactual situation exactly what, like, the language of reasons and points and purposes would look like. But yeah, in that sort of case, it seems that they would consider that to be a perfectly, purposeful or, an activity that has a point. And I wouldn't think that there's anything wrong with their judgment.
Yeah. I mean, there's one thing to say, ultimately you don't think there is anything wrong, but would you go so far as to say you're baffled by the idea that anyone would have the intuition? I mean, let me just spell out the intuition in a couple of other ways that we could think about. Suppose you have a kid and then your kid says, what I'm going to do is count blades of grass. You just you're just wasting your life. That is just totally pointless. You're just wasting your life. Think of Camus with the myth of what's it called? Sisyphus. That this guy is condemned to push the rock up and let it fall down the other side. And we're struck by how horrific this is because it's such a totally pointless, trivial activity. You saying you don't kind of even get that intuition? I mean, we could say maybe it's a deep delusion. We could say that we find hard to shake, but are you just at the psychological level? You saying you can't even relate to that intuition, that this is that a community that just dedicated their lives to counting the numbers in the middle of words or counting blades of grass, even though they didn't enjoy it, that there wouldn't be something wrong. I don't know, or something like a waste of life. It feels like a waste of life, or yeah. I'm repeating myself a little bit.
No, I don't think I do, but I think maybe there's sort of two things that are worth distinguishing. So
you don't think you do relate to the intuition?
No,
right.
But I've always been extremely sort of, I guess, libertarian in my attitudes, and the idea of like I sort of, I'm okay with people pretty much doing whatever they want with their own, with their own lives, let's say, and so to me, somebody counting blades of grass, it just I don't know, it doesn't seem wrong to me. That just seems like, okay, they have an interest that I maybe find a bit bizarre. I don't understand it, perhaps. Like, it's not something I'm interested in. And
what do you mean you don't understand it?
I mean that it's like it feels like, I suppose I can't see the appeal myself, whereas I can with some things. So sometimes, for instance, I'll watch a movie and I might dislike the movie, but I might be able to think, well, I can perhaps appreciate the cinematography or something. And so that gives me an ability to sympathize or maybe empathize with other people who do have that. Whereas that maybe isn't the case with somebody counting blades of grass. I'm not sure, though, because I mean, I do have sort of some slight compulsive behavior, so maybe I can. But my point is just, on the one hand, there's that sort of just live and let live sort of attitude. And on the other hand, there's this point about what people, whether or not we have stance-independent reasons or categorical reasons. Now, what I do understand is I completely understand why people would say, like, counting blades of grass is pointless. I think I understand that. So, you know, like if we're just talking about that sort of intuition, then that's fine. Obviously, I would, you know, if philosophers were to then come along and say, well, you know, what's being expressed there is the sort of stance independent or categorical reason not to count blades of grass, I might object and say, you know, either that's just the wrong way to analyze what the people who have that intuition, you know, what that intuition actually is, or maybe, you know, it's like a projection of one's own attitudes or something like that. But yeah, I mean, if you ask me, like, do you have the intuition that there's something wrong or something pointless about counting blades of grass? I mean, well, no, no.
Yeah, maybe we could move on to other examples, but just yeah. So I agree with you. You know, it's I'm not trying to make any claims about what people ordinarily mean.
Hmm.
You know, because I'm sure they mean all sorts of different things in different contexts. But just as you're talking now, I mean, what it seems to me plausible that when people think about the myth of Sisyphus, or they think about, you know, this idea from the God's eye perspective, everything we do is sort of pointless. Or when people think, you know, what am I doing with my life? You know, what am I? Is this? I'm working for this company, and you know, what's the point of it all? What's the, you know, is it just like trivial waste of time? You know, I think when people are in that mindset, that I think they are thinking in this sense, in this radically non-Humean sense of just what life goals are worth pursuing, you know, or what life goals are just trivial. So that's my last attempt to say you don't get that.
Um, no,
And then you say that.
no. I mean, it's actually that's quite a good example of this, because if somebody was to say, like, what's the point of it all? That's a kind of case where, like, you know, maybe I can sort of wrap my head around that. If I can, maybe if it's like a theist who is asking what goals God has with respect to the human race or something like that. But I mean, yeah, I beyond that, I have no idea what that means.
Right.
So, yeah.
Fair enough. So let's think about a different case, sort of about norms in evidence. Then, you know, like that when we say you ought to apportion your belief to the evidence, or you shouldn't believe contradictions. And I mean, an interesting case of this is you know, Bart Stroimer, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
who's a defender of the error theory. But just for people who don't know, this might be interesting, that he actually thinks, although he defends the error theory, he thinks it's impossible to believe, because he thinks it's inconsistent. You can't psychologically believe something and reflectively think that you have no reason to believe it. Whereas if the error theory is true, there are no reasons to believe anything. So you can't believe the error theory without also thinking you don't have reason to believe the error theory, because there are no reasons. So he says, he doesn't say he believes the error theory, he says the arguments point in that direction. Whereas, you know, at that point I want to say, like, this is, so it was like, I think when you read Mackey, John Mackey, who's the famous, you know, error theorist, you know, kind of original error theorist, maybe 40 years ago, you know, he was just talking about error theory about moral value, and he was just taking, you know, the norms, the value above evidence, or, you know, all sorts of other value claims for granted, but just realizing that how ubiquitous value is just makes you think, you know, I know you're not necessarily an error theorist, but error theory ends up being so almost like a radical skeptical hypothesis. You know, it's like we're saying my brain's in vats or something. To my mind, it's just, you know, if there's no reason to believe anything, then, and then it starts to look like, to me, like this is just a reasonable foundational starting point.
Yeah, yeah.
To say, yeah. Anyway, yeah. So anyway, what just a general invitation to what do you think about those value claims behind?
Yeah, so I mean, again, I think that oh, I mean, I should say, just, you know, for anybody watching this, you know, error theorists do take sort of different lines on this, you know, particular problem. I mean, there are some error theorists who are quite happy to accept epistemic norms. They're happy to be realists about them. Richard Joyce is. So I
My
don't know.
colleague Chris Cowie actually is his book on the error theory. He defends the idea that
Yeah. So just again for anybody not familiar, I have to say I I like Bart Strumer's work. I don't know if he's necessarily done us any favors with saying that the position is that this, at least that kind of anti-realism, is impossible to believe. I don't agree with him on that point. I think that the sort of line I take on this is, look, I'm happy to say that I have reasons to believe things. It's just that, again, so what would I mean by that? Well, it would be something like, I have particular goals with respect to inquiry. I want to hold true beliefs. I want to avoid false beliefs, and I'm also sort of I assume that other people have similar goals to that. So if we're engaging in inquiry, I'm probably just going to assume that you also want to hold true beliefs and avoid false beliefs, and then there are better and worse ways of achieving that. I think that when I say that I have a reason to believe something, then I would just understand it in those terms, in terms of the goal of truth, and I can give an argument to the effect that a particular claim is true, or that a particular claim is false, and then that's a reason to believe. I think that one thing I would say is that in this particular case, I think that part of the reason why it might seem like there are sort of stance independent reasons, or like reasons that are not somehow dependent on desires, is because we might say that it seems like with the case of belief, right? To believe something just is to take it to be true. So when I give an argument to the effect that something is true, it's like, well, that just is an argument that for believing it, maybe. Again, I'm not sure about that. I'm actually inclined to think that sometimes I might try to believe things that I take to be false. It might be the case that there are some beliefs I might be able to recognize that some beliefs would bring me comfort, and then I might intentionally try to get those beliefs. But putting aside cases like that, it seems like this might be one thing. This might be one sort of way in which it seems very strange to say, well, our reasons for belief are ultimately going to come down to claims about our desires. But I don't know. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd like to think more about that interesting claim you just made, but about whether the fact that you believe it to be true makes some essential connection to directedness of truth. But I'll maybe reflect more on that. But just, so I thought, I thought you might say that, and I'd still want to press, obviously, that it's in some way close to self-evident that people aiming at the false, there's something wrong there. But obviously, I don't think that pressing that on you would get us very far. But there, I think there is a little bit of trickiness in the argument you want to make, because it's not totally clear to me that probability is itself value free. Obviously, probability means lots of different things. We can have objective probability, objective chances, like you get in some interpretations of quantum mechanics. But a lot of our probability discourse, if you think of like Bayesian discourse, Bayesian probability, I think on the face of it, what we're doing there is talking about what you ought to believe, or in Bayesian context, you don't think of belief as a kind of binary thing. Just, I'm not saying this for your sake, but just in case people listening, watching, not familiar, we don't talk about belief as a sort of binary thing. You talk about credence, like degree of belief. And often what you're assessing is how much credence should you have. Often it's conditional. How much credence should you have in this proposition given this proposition? And so when we're talking about how likely something is in that sense, I'm tempted to say like one plausible theory of that. I'm not totally sure of this, but one plausible theory of what that kind of probability is just about what you ought to believe. So if we can't analyze Bayesian probabilities without value, then I'm not sure you can run that kind of story you want to run.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And I mean, it might be the case that, well, certainly, I think it's surely the case that somebody could develop a probability theory which just explicitly makes claims about what people ought not to believe. I mean, there's nothing in principle, somebody could do that. I'm not. I mean, look, I'm no expert on Bayesianism. I'm not inclined to think that it has to be interpreted that way. So if we think about, like, so a basic claim would be something like, if we say that, I don't know, X evidentially supports Y, that would mean something like the probability of, the probability of Y given X is greater than the probability of Y, right? Or something along those lines. So, I mean, and then you can make the point.
But what does probability mean in that claim?
Well, if we're talking about Bayesianism, it would just be subjective credences, right?
Well,
like degrees of belief, subjective degrees of belief.
That's what you plug into it, but how do you spell out, that it? I mean, the kind of credence. I mean, how we talk about how likely X is given Y. What does that mean? Or just when we get the posterior, let's say when we do the Bayesian calculation and we get the posterior probability, we say, there's a 50% chance you've got you've got COVID. That's exactly what I could think of. What do we mean by that? What do we mean by that? There's a 50% chance.
Well, again, if it's Bayesianism, then it's subjective credence, isn't it? Or like, maybe I'm missing the point.
What do you mean it's subjective credence?
Oh, I mean, okay, so
we say
okay, I'm not sure. So like, I don't know, and I mean, this is one reason why I'm not sure that I would accept Bayesianism, because I don't. I have problems with the notions of like credence and degrees of belief. There are, so I'm not sure. But so I don't know. I couldn't give that. I'm just trying to.
Example. Suppose we decide, we look at all the arguments for God, for and against God, and we decide there's a 5% chance God exists, just for the sake of discussion. Well, what does that claim mean? It's not objective. We're not talking about objective chances in the sense of quantum mechanics, like a fact about the world. What does that mean? There's a 5% chance. I'm inclined to say what that means is, and I'm not sure about this, but you ought to have a credence of 5% that God exists.
Okay, I see. So I think.
Sorry, I didn't make that very clear.
I think I understand, and I think I disagree. But maybe I've misunderstood. So the way that I would look at this is, look, what you get from the sort of Bayesian machinery, let's say, is you're going to have a bunch of sort of subjective credences for particular propositions, and I mean, what exactly that means is unclear, perhaps, and maybe it doesn't really matter because as Bayesians see it, you can just plug in pretty much whatever priors you want, and you sort of run it enough times, everybody converges. But whatever. So the point is, you have a bunch of numbers, right? And then you plug it into the machinery, and then that comes out with like 5% for God exists. So I don't really see why that would be a claim about what you ought to believe. I think that would just be the claim that, look, if you have these, if you assign these probabilities to these propositions, then we can show that it would be inconsistent not to assign a probability of 5% to the proposition that God exists.
Good, yeah.
But that's not going to.
Sorry,
there's a difference between, obviously, like it would be inconsistent to assign a probability of 5%, and you ought or ought not to assign a probability of 5%.
Yeah, so this is actually something my colleague Chris Cowie goes into in quite a lot of work in his book, and yeah, I mean he wants to sort of do this reductive project with Bayesian. Um, but so I think there are two difficulties. So one is perhaps an easier one of how do we get the credences we put in the first place?
Mm.
And maybe there you could just say there's nothing objective. It's just whatever credences you happen to have. I mean, I still think that's baffling, but anyway. But then the question is, once you plug them in and you do the Bayesian calculation, I mean, it's not showing any inconsistency, is it? It's what it's essentially saying is this bit of maths tells you if you started off with these credences, this is where you should, and then you assign all these credence. This is what the credence you ought to end up with is. Well, that's how I would put it. And if that's not what we're saying, what the hell is this? What's the point of this bit of maths? Why are we doing this? It's like a game or something. Why are we? Do you see what I mean? Like what? So it's not just about what credences you plug in. Why are we doing this? What is the credence? What is it we get out of Bayes' theorem? So I think what we get out is like if you had those initial credences, you should now have this credence. But how would you interpret it? Or if you don't say it that way, why are we playing this game of Bayes' theorem?
I would have thought the point is because, like I said, I aim for true beliefs. I want to avoid false beliefs, and I mean, if I'm using, I'm going to assume that this is a sort of reliable piece of machinery to get me to true beliefs. I think it would just come down to that for me.
It's just something that if you apply it, it tends to get you to true beliefs.
Yeah, and I mean to be clear, like I said, I don't want to sort of come out in defense of Bayesianism here. So I mean, don't but insofar as I'm applying
if you had to give up on Bayes' theorem, though, wouldn't I mean that would be a bit hard to sustain if you had.
I think that maybe this is like a whole tangent, but I am inclined to think that I worry that there are contexts where it ends up being it ends up requiring a sort of over precision. Let's say I think there are lots of contexts where we make inferences which where I wouldn't think we would have to apply this sort of machinery, but I don't know. That might be a whole other debate.
Yeah, I mean, look, I can understand the position that a sort of subjective Bayesian that you think the probabilities are sort of arbitrary. I mean, I still find that hard, or certainly it's hard to get precise numbers in a lot of Bayesian calculations. But I think giving up on Bayes' theorem altogether would be, it's just sort of huge application.
Yeah, I'm not. I wouldn't give up on it altogether.
And
no.
If I was understanding you rightly, your interpretation is. So what is the probability you get out? How do we interpret that? Say the probability gets out, 5% chance God exists or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Then it just means if that is the probability you will go for, put it as a hypothetical ought. If you want true beliefs, that is the probability you will go for. I suppose then I would want to know why does Bayes' theorem tend to do that? It's not, I can understand that kind of approach on just a frequentist approach of probability where you just say, look in nature at, which things are more common. Maybe that's going to get you to true beliefs, but Bayes' theorems are quite like an abstract bit of mathematics. It's not like we know it's successful testing it empirically. I mean, maybe we do as well, but it's sort of, that's not how Bayes came up with it. It's, yeah, maybe I'm rambling slightly at this point. Does any of that make sense? Or
it yes does. I mean, it does, and I mean, I'm not sure. Like why does it work? Well, I don't know. I guess I'd have to look into more detail about the mathematics, but offhand. I mean, so I think a lot of what you get from probability theory can just sort of, again, it just comes down to consistency, right? There are going to be some assignments that are inconsistent. So that's going to be at least part of the answer.
Yeah, but it's not just consistency based theorems. It's not. But yeah, okay. So anyway, I mean, I guess we've discussed that a bit. Just to flag up that I think it's not so easy to just say, oh, these are conditional hypothetical oughts. Like, if you want the truth, go for this, because it's not at all clear. There is a controversy about how we can construe probability without seeing it as involving value claims. But yeah, it's a complicated topic that I'm not totally sure of.
I'm just curious though. So like, because if it's the case that Bayes' theorem, like, isn't a reliable mechanism for getting us at the truth, then I would be inclined to just say, well, then I don't care about that. Like, why would I bother doing that? I want to get at the truth.
I think it's reliable.
And if it is,
it tells us what we ought to believe, because it's a way of tracking what we ought to believe. So I think when we say in this context, I might be wrong about this. I'm not an expert on the philosophy of probability, but when we say in this context, there's a 60% chance, there's a 90% chance, man-made climate change or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
What we mean is you ought to have a credence of 90% on that. So,
okay.
And Bayes' theorem tells us if you start off, if at the start of inquiry you have the credences you ought to have, then you end up with it tells you the answer. So you input the credences, certain facts about credences you ought to have, and then the new evidence, plug in the new evidence, and you get out what credences you now ought to have. So I think Bayes' theorem does get us to the truth, because it tells us what credences we ought to have. But
okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure you could tell that whole story without talking about what credences you ought to have. I'm very open to correction on this.
Probably not. It's just I don't know. I don't know what work the ought is doing there. Like the ought is doing there. It seems like we could, if I was to have some sort of theorem that's like, I don't know, an anti-Bayes theorem that just delivers the opposite results. I mean, that. So like I wouldn't, that's kind of similarly just a kind of, let's say, descriptive piece of mathematics, right? And then we've got Bayes' theorem, which is a piece of mathematics. Now, what I'm saying is that, all right, like this one here is, it turns out that reliably gets us to consistent beliefs or true beliefs or whatever. And it's like, all right, well, if we think that, if we accept that, then why isn't it enough to just say that I desire true beliefs and this is a mechanism for achieving true beliefs? On the other hand, if we don't accept that, then I don't know why I would care about Bayes' theorem at all. Like, even if it is the case that it tells me in some sense what I ought to believe. Like, if there's some other theorem that was tracking the truth, then I'd go with that one.
I see the force of what you're saying. I don't know. But on the other hand, it's almost like you're saying, it's not like we empirically tested this. We got all these candidates for Bayes' theorem and we put them out in the world, and so we've got something here that gets us to the truth, but we haven't sort of tested its reliability. It's not like a sort of detector that we tested whether it works.
Mm-hmm.
So how is it? Yeah, I mean, what's going on here?
Yeah, okay.
And it's sort of intuitive. I think Bayes, when he came up with it, and when people reason through it, in my philosophy of religion classes, I think people think, the undergraduates think they're going to get an easy ride doing philosophy of religion. They'll just be able to do their high school philosophy, but I make them do Bayes' theorem, and they're all like, but you reason through it, and it makes intuitive sense. It's not like you have to say, I know this is totally opaque, but we've tested it scientifically and it does deliver the truth. You can see that it's gonna. Anyway, Yeah. Should I move on to something else? Well,
I'm,
how long you got? We
oh,
good?
well, I mean, as long as you have, I have no other plans for tonight, so
I'd probably better go in like 20 minutes or so if
no problem.
kids get me up early. But well, I don't know if you got anything to raise, but well, there's one more thing I want to raise. But did you want to raise anything or?
Um, I mean, there wasn't anything in particular. I'm afraid. No,
So that's all right. That's all
after
right.
you asked, I thought, well, I'll just sort of wait to see what you bring
That's
up.
fine. I'm hosting your podcast. So, but I mean, so let's say, right, you don't get that intuition, coming back to the starting intuition that, some things are worth doing, others aren't, right? Okay, fair enough. But now, I mean, in this sort of radically non-Humean
Mhm.
sense, when we clarify that it's in, but now I want to just to ask you whether you think what you think about my position. So from my perspective is um I do strongly have that intuition. That seems to me, really almost self-evident. But then some people might say, I mean, I'm just imagining lots of people listening to this might say, oh yeah, they get my intuition, but why should you trust intuitions? You know what I mean? Why should you trust that, you know, you should do science to find out what the world's like or something? But just to say something about my thoughts on that, I mean, I think any serious, most of our knowledge is reliant on trusting experiences. I mean, I think Descartes was right, that all I really know for certain is my own conscious experience right now. I might have been created a minute ago with all my memories. I might not exist in a moment's time. All I really have direct contact with is my own conscious experience right now. So if I'm going to get outside that solipsism of my experience right now, I've just got to trust that some of my experiences are putting me in contact with objective reality. I trust my senses, I trust my memory. I think most people, I shouldn't say most people, a lot of people think, oh, well, it's okay to trust your senses and trust your memory, but you can't just trust your value intuitions. But I want to know what justifies that double standard. So, it seems to me that intuition that some things are worth doing, some things aren't, seems to me more evident than the deliverances of my memory, or that there's a table in front of me. So why should I trust my senses and memory but not trust that intuition? So I think the human epistemological situation is kind of not ideal. All we can do is just trust the things that seem most evident, and that certain value intuitions seem to me more evident than the external world. So I mean, I think if I was going to rank things, I'd have mathematics and logic seems most evident.
Mhm.
Trusting empirical fact, trusting your senses, trusting memory are at the bottom, although still quite evident. And value intuitions, certain value intuitions, seem to me somewhere in the middle. And so I just wonder if you have any thoughts about whether from my lights, as someone who has that intuition, has that, is that a sort of legitimate way of going about things, or yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I have a very permissive view of rationality. I tend to think that, you know, I don't know, maybe it's kind of a broadly sort of pragmatist type approach, perhaps, but I tend to think, we come into inquiry with a bunch of beliefs, and we can doubt pretty much any belief. Whenever we doubt a belief, it's always on the basis of sort of holding certain other things fixed for the purposes of that inquiry. We have to start somewhere. I don't think there's anything irrational about like starting with whatever you happen to find yourself with. Like, I open my eyes, I have certain sensory data, I have intellectual seemings, I guess. I don't. So yeah, I'm quite conciliatory. I think I don't think that moral realism or value realism or whatever is irrational. One thing I would say is I think that we do have to be a bit careful about claims about like trusting intuitions, because what I want to say is, well, I feel like I also have intuitions about this. So there are some things that kind of, you know, I might say like, I don't know. It's with the example of like activities being worthwhile or worthless. I'm not sure I even do have the intuition on that one. But if you think about a moral claim like torturing children is wrong, okay, well, I mean, in that case, I react very strongly to that. I have a very strong, like yes, of course, torturing children is wrong. But it's one thing to sort of have that reaction, and then it's another to say, well, like, does that in any way support realism? And I'm inclined to think that it doesn't. I think that to get to something like realism, we'd have to be saying, well, it's a stance-independent fact that torturing children is wrong. And for that claim, I have no intuition whatsoever. And I'm not sure. I mean, maybe some people do have the intuition in favour of that, but I'm not sure how prevalent that would be. I think if you distinguish the normative claim from the claim that explicitly builds realism into it, there are going to be fewer people with that intuition. So again, that's a slightly different example to the one you used, because actually, as I say, when it comes to claims about activities being worthwhile or not, I don't know if I have. Again, I don't think I have any intuition about that, or my intuition is they're all fine, or maybe I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that it's an important point. I mean, I always find it's reminded me a little bit. I find it difficult arguing with expressivists. So for people who don't know this, expressivists think very roughly when you make value claims, you're not making statements about reality, or in some sense expressing your desires or your attitudes. So the crudest theory, AJA, used to think when you say murder's bad, you're sort of saying murder, boo. And when you're saying giving to charity is good, you're saying yay, giving to charity. And there are very, very sophisticated versions by people like Simon Blackburn. Simon Blackburn thinks you can, if you get very sophisticated, you can still say things are true, and you can still but it starts to get the point, like with a Blackburn type position, where you believe in moral objectivity, because they'll say, yes, I believe in moral objectivity.
Sorry, you just kind of cut out for a second.
Where did that cut out?
Sorry, you said it gets to the point with the Blackburn position where...
With Simon Blackburn, yeah. Am I back? Am I here?
You are.
When it gets to the Simon Blackburn position, it's almost... You can't ask whether they believe in moral objectivity. I'm not talking necessarily about Simon Blackburn in particular, but some expressivists, they'll say, yes, of course I believe in moral objectivity. I think, murder is really wrong. But then they're just, but they're expressing when they give that answer, they're expressing their attitudes. And so I sort of think, okay, I'm not making any oversimplistic claims about what ordinary people mean. I enjoyed your discussion with Lance Butch, about what ordinary people mean. But it must be possible for us to be able to say, look, I'm asking you a question, and I'm explicitly stipulating that the claim I'm asking you is not couched in expressivist terms, and similarly with this debate about, I'm talking about some things being worth doing, some things aren't. Of course, you could interpret that in a sort of Humean way, like relative to our desires in some sense, and maybe that's what people mean, maybe they don't. But it should be possible as kind of reasonably sophisticated philosophers, not that sophisticated, but we've had a bit of education, that we can just stipulate, no, look, what I mean is, I'm meaning in a totally not cognitivist, that means not expressivist and non-Humean sense. Some things are worth doing and other things aren't. And we can just pin it down that way in this highly philosophical context. Do you think? Does that sound right?
Yeah,
I'm not saying that gets us anywhere, but yeah,
I have no objection to that. I don't know. I'm not sure if what I said implied an objection to that. Maybe it did.
No,
right, yeah.
I didn't mean that.
Yeah, I agree. I often find it I find it a little bit frustrating, like you said, trying to talk to some of the more sophisticated expressivists because of this point where they seem to be making so many sort of conciliations to realism that it's almost like they want to make it impossible to state the disagreement,
Yes.
right? And
Yes.
it's
That was exactly the point I was trying to make. Yeah, you made it better yourself.
Yeah. So yeah, I certainly hope that nothing I've said would have
No.
yeah. So yeah, I agree on that.
No, I think if I was going to be an anti-realist, I don't. I just have a simpler sort of constructivist position where, morality is some kind of socially constructed practice, maybe where you don't put your own interests before other people's or something. I don't have to be more sophisticated than that. But there's no objective reason to buy into that. Most of us do. And just get things off the ground that way, and make, it's slightly revisionary because at least if you think in standard practice, we do think these ought to kind of categorical rather than hypothetical. And yeah, it's too sophisticated for its own good, expressivism. Not that I've engaged with it in great detail, but I mean, I guess just finally then, what do you think about hypothetical? So I mean, one of the points I was discussing on Twitter, that I think a lot of people just think hypothetical odds are totally unproblematic. But there's at least a question here, because if you just look at a hypothetical, it seems to be bridging the is-ought gap. You say, if you want to be a lawyer, you ought to go to law school. That's going from an is to an ought, and so why is it any less metaphysically bizarre to go from my desires to some kind of ought than to go from somebody else's desires to some kind of ought? Like Sarah wants to go to law school, so I should help her or something, so and it's kind of ironic, I think, that Hume kind of, I don't think Hume notices this. I don't think Mackie notices it. And Hume says, reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. It's almost like, so there's, I mean, that was actually really what, going back to a bit of autobiography, persuaded me against Mackie, thinking, if you can just take hypothetical odds for granted, then we can just, if you want to be nice to people, then you've got a reason to. But once you appreciate, actually, there's a kind of ought there as well. And if we're suspicious of normativity across the board, there's no reason to think or do anything. Anyway.
Yeah.
So,
I think I agree. I think hypothetical normativity is just as puzzling. Actually, the point about Mackie, I read an article, I can't remember who it was, I think it was by somebody Phillips, and it's something like, I think it might be called like Mackie on practical reason or something like that. But he thinks that actually Mackie did not make this mistake. So he has a slightly different interpretation of what Mackie's doing. But anyway, no.
Who was that again? Sorry.
I'd have to. You know what? I'll get the article and then I'll tell you. I'll send it. Or I'll put it up on the video as well for people who are interested.
Brilliant,
so yeah, what was I saying? When I mean, look, I will, use this language. But if I say something like, so I like, look out the window and I see it's raining and I think, oh, I ought to put on a coat. So we might say, okay, that's a hypothetical ought, right? Like, if you want to stay dry, you ought to put on a coat. I would be inclined to sort of give maybe a kind of pragmatic account of what's going on when we use that language. For me, all I'm expressing when I say that is I have, say, a desire to stay dry. Putting on a coat is a means of staying dry. Putting on a coat doesn't frustrate any of my other desires. And, I mean, there's no ought in any of them. Now, if you were to then ask, well, why ought you do what meets these conditions 1 to 3? There is no further ought. I think that, yes, some anti-realists have this tendency to endorse a kind of instrumentalism about practical reason, where they'll say, you ought to do what satisfies your desires. I don't go in for that. I think that's just as puzzling.
So that's brilliant. Yeah. So I don't think we disagree on that much. I mean, yeah. So I think if you thought this through consistently and you say something like that, then the problem goes away. I just suspect that a lot of people, especially people, outside of academic philosophy. I mean, a lot of people, I think, who think of themselves as anti-realists accept hypothetical oughts and they're not thinking of it in that way. I mean, I'm inclined to think, again, this is a claim about what ordinary people think, and I might be wrong about this, but like if you say, you really want to be a lawyer, you really want to do this, and this is your last chance to fill in your application for law school, and you don't do it, you think you're stupid. You should do. You really want to, so you should. I think that's what we tend to mean, and I just suspect a lot of people believe in hypothetical oughts in that strong sense, and maybe believe in oughts about evidence in that strong sense, and it can be quite persuasive just to persuade people to that. It was persuasive in my case, right?
Yeah.
I thought I was an error theorist. I I say this like I guess undergraduates, so many undergraduates are inclined to some kind of value anti-realism. I was certainly myself. Not that it's a childish position, but that's just a sociological fact. And I think a lot of people, I suspect, once they see actually you've really got to give up on hypothetical oughts and oughts about evidence, then it can be very persuasive. But for people who've thought it through and think no, then it's I was going to say one more thing in response to what you said. No, I don't know. It's gone. Okay, yeah.
Well, yeah,
sorry, go on.
So yeah, I mean, just to, you may well be right about that. I don't know. I think that one point I would say in defense of this is that, I haven't so obviously I've heard people use reason's language, but it's not like I've sat them down and sort of said, okay, here's different ways of interpreting that. Here's different things you might be committed to. But you might be right, and it is possible as well that maybe there's some sort of just conceptual deficiency on my part. Like maybe this way of thinking about reasons and oughts is normal, and for some reason I just I don't get it, or like there's something missing. It could be the case, it could be like a sort of some people are colorblind, right? And there have been cases where I've studied particular philosophical topics and felt like I just haven't got it. Maybe that's happening here. So, yeah.
Well, my podcast, Mind Chat, plug my podcast, Mind Chat, is with, Keith Frankish, who's an illusionist, doesn't believe in consciousness, at least as philosophers normally define it. And, one possibility is maybe he's a zombie, maybe he's not conscious, and maybe Daniel Dennett isn't conscious, and this is why we're having these. I mean, there's another interesting debate on cognitive phenomenology, on thought experience, whether thought is a kind of experience. Mm-hmm. And there seems to be like a real divide on this. It's a question about human experience, and we are humans. So you'd think we could just settle this by attending to our experience. But when people like people like Susanna Siegel attend to their experience, they think it's obvious that there's sort of experience is permeated with meaning and understanding. Like when I look around, I don't just see colors and shapes, I see a cup, and the fact that it's a cup is part of the character of my experience, or the fact that I'm looking at a face is part. Or when I look at words, that's a good one. It's part. I mean, I share this intuition with Susanna Siegel that it's part of the character of my experience, the meaning of those words, what they mean. Whereas Michael Ty thinks, no, it's just kind of colors and shapes and stuff. He just doesn't. It's sort of like, and maybe he just doesn't have. Maybe we have understanding experience, and he doesn't have it. He just has sort of some information processing. I remember the thing I was going to say about just sometimes you talk about this hypothetical oughts thing, and then people say, oh, well, what else are you going to mean? And this came, you and Lance seem to be saying something a little bit like this. What else would you mean by ought apart from something kind of hypothetical? But I mean, okay, yes, you can just define ought to mean something hypothetical, like you just did, but you could also just define ought to mean maximizes the good. You know what I mean? Or
Yeah.
so I don't know. Some people just seem to think. Sometimes anti-realists seem to think there's some more natural interpretation of ought language that connects it to things hypothetical, whereas connecting it to something non-hypothetical is something mysterious. But I don't really get that, you know.
I mean, all I would say is I mean, yeah. You could just define it that way. That's fine. Actually, I'm inclined to think that I'm increasingly inclined in response to sort of moral naturalists who, you know, might sort of take that sort of route to just say, okay, well, maybe it just turns out that we basically agree on everything that matters. You know, I think that there's. I mean, I suppose what's missing in sort of saying, well, you know, what you ought to do is what maximizes the good is. I think, okay, like, why should I care about maximizing the good though? Like, it seems like the ought, defining it that way misses the normativity. But maybe maybe that's a good thing if, like me, you find normativity puzzling and you're in favour of eliminating it. So I don't know. Maybe.
Right. So,
Yeah.
but if you say, why should I care about the good? And then I say, well, you've got some desire. But that's still, I thought you agreed that still doesn't give you an ought. So why is that any better an answer than, well, it helps other people?
Well, it might be the case that my goal is not to maximize the good, and if you tell me that you're just going to define, if a moral naturalist just says, well, look, I'm just defining the term ought to mean maximizes the good. I mean, well, okay, but that's not going to move me at all. I mean, you're just.
So it's now just the fact that it would not persuade you, but it might do. It might do. I mean, it very likely would do if you could change someone's goals by if all we're talking about is, you know, what is likely to get someone to do something, then, you know, it might do by saying, you know, God, you bastard, what, you know, how can you do this? That might, you know, get them to change their goal.
Yeah, maybe.
So
Yeah,
I'm just suspicious when people think there's some, you know, that hypothetical oughts make sense in a way others don't. I'm suspicious that they're really believing in some strong normativity.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that hypothetical oughts make sense.
I can't justify that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it seems like we agree on almost everything, really. It's just, you know, you even think my position is rational. You're not sort of saying it's crazy. Just it's just you don't share that intuition.
If you want like the real heated debate, then you know, you should talk to Lance, because
okay,
he's better at that kind of. That was, I mean, I mentioned that video title was sort of a joke, and it was a bit of a joke for me. I don't know if it was a joke from his point of view. No, he's very militant about you know, getting rid of moral realism. But I don't mind. I don't, like I say, I don't see it as being necessarily irrational. So
well, it was instructive listening to him about, you know, we can't assume too quickly what other people mean by the, you know, that's sure that should be an empirical question, shouldn't it? But yeah. But yeah, I guess it comes down to if this value intuition seems to me more evident than the external world, why the hell shouldn't I believe it? Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Well, I think that's been a really helpful discussion, and
great. Yeah, that was really good.
I've forgotten to plug my book. My publishers will shout me, but my book's got nothing to do with what we've been talking about.
That's okay. Yeah,
it's called Galileo's Error, and it's about consciousness and panpsychism, and it's aimed at a general audience. And
do you want me to put up any links in the description or anything? I mean, maybe you could send them to me afterwards, and I'll put them.
Yeah, just my website, philipgoffphilosophy.com, Twitter, Philip_Goff, 1L in Philip, GOFF F for foxtrot.
Okay.
But yeah. Brilliant. Thanks for having me on.
Well,
And,
yeah, thanks for that. I'll stop the recording now. So goodbye, everybody.